to Simpler. We are three pastors, husbands, and fathers on a journey to make life simpler by holding Jesus as the core for every belief and practice. This journey has shaped us to be more like Christ, freed us from the shame of failure, and encouraged us to a deeper love of our Lord and God. We invite you to join us in the discussions that have shaped and continue to shape our lives.
But I'm thankful for our relationship in that like, if anything is brought up where like anybody has to clarify or you add clarification to a certain thing, like it's not a shot at any of us personally, because the goal is ultimately Jesus, and within a podcast you need to communicate clearly. We need to also agree upon language, and so there's certain aspects of it that like, we know are outside of us, and we also know that like that we're brothers in Christ, that there's a relationship here that is built upon the foundation of who Christ has made us to be, and so therefore why would I be? There's no need to be offended. Period. Let alone the fact that that's not what we mean. Like what our goal, we're striving towards our goal. There's a podcast I listened to recently, and by recently probably like 4 years ago, but I need to see where they are now. But I remember listening to them and be like, you can tell these guys aren't even remotely close because they still spend.
Wait, you can tell that the people in the podcast are not, their relationship
is not very close.
Gotcha.
And maybe
one's in
just
Asia, one's in Europe, one's in Africa.
Well, maybe, but specifically, the relationship's not close. And maybe even then, kind of to piggyback off what I said a second ago, maybe they don't fully understand their relationship just as brothers in Christ in general. But they would, every time they'd bring up, it felt like anything. The person bringing it up would have to apologize for 30 seconds and then say what they wanted to say. And they're like, well, I didn't mean there's a shot at you. And then they had to keep going, keep kind of trying to maintain the peace or whatever. But like, I'm like, okay, fine, just make the point. Just have a conversation. Just be normal. But that's how most people work socially, is because you're right. Just the act in saying no to somebody in itself is a contrary act, but that's not the heart behind it. That's not the intention behind it.
Sometimes it's not.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, sorry. What I mean specifically is like, no, it is. Sorry, what I meant is that it doesn't have to be necessarily a contrary act, but it of course can be. So yeah.
It's fun when you get to a place of conversation where you can actually have a conversation where you're not having to navigate around people taking you wrong every time.
Yeah,
doesn't mean they don't. Just like, I mean, I'm not under the assumption that every time I say something, it doesn't hurt y'all's feelings.
What'd you just say?
I'm not so naive to think that when I say things that there's not a personal sense of like defensiveness that happens in you guys. I just need to make sure I clarify enough to where even if you have that initial shock, you go, oh.
It can be squashed.
Well, barring things like last April, where for whatever reason I got frustrated with you. I don't feel like I normally take offense at it.
Oh, that's good.
I take offense from both of you guys at things that I make up in my own mind. like it's totally stupid stuff, you know?
That's funny.
And then I go, like, I do this with everybody though. It's not just you guys, but it's people who are closest to me. It's not people I don't care about. And I'll be like, I bet they're mad at me. And I create this whole scenario, and then I start feeling myself getting panicky. And then I'm like, Ryan, none of that has happened.
Stop it.
You know that you're just making this up in your own head, you stupid piece of garbage.
That's like what Nehemiah says to the king. No, the
the people who send letters to him. He's like, you're just creating all of this out of your own head. Except for I'm the guy writing the letter and Nehemiah.
That's right. Yeah.
You're having your own conversation.
Totally.
I was doing a Q&A night with the youth a while back, and when somebody brought up depression and anxiety,
and I said, go talk to Ryan.
Yeah. And so I shared a little bit, and I talked about like with anxiety, with both of those, I have a tiny little bit of experience of my own, but nothing like Ryan, nothing like a lot of people who live through it. And I brought up a story of a guy who used to go to the 456, and no joke, he said, I didn't study enough for the test tomorrow. I'm going to fail, and I'm never going to get married. And that's
his line of thought.
That's the statement he told me. And what's so funny is it makes no sense to people like you and me, but there was 2 or 3 youth in the group that were like, yep, exactly. I understand. What? And so like, I remember back then turning to the guy and saying, walk me through that. Yeah. And then he walked me for 20 minutes, what every single step means. And it all goes back to his not being able to pass this test. Therefore, I can't do this. I can't do this again. And therefore, no woman's going to ever want me. So I'm never going to get married. And so I asked him, I remember
he needs to learn that his identity is actually in Christ.
You're right. There's been a lot of growth in him. I shouldn't say obviously because you don't know. There's been a lot of growth in him.
Did he pass the test?
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, I don't know.
Is he married?
I don't think he's married.
Nope, he failed.
That's right. But what's funny is it just doesn't make sense for a lot of people. Or sorry, it doesn't make sense people like you and me, Micah. But seeing their eyes like light up as I was talking, I was like, you guys get this weird amount of anxiety? You understand it and not get it.
Oh, it's ridiculous.
Yeah.
And I'm at least smart enough now to go, Ryan, that's ridiculous.
That's ridiculous. Don't follow that train of thought.
Yeah. So crazy.
So crazy. I didn't play that video for you guys a second ago, but I can do it later. I forgot what I was gonna say, but we can going over to the PCC. Let's step on over to the PCC, everybody. Welcome to Pierce's Culture Corner. So one of the things that I am I feel like the Lord put it on my heart in the midst of having a second child. Our second daughter will be here in May, so about a month and a half or so from now. And during that whole process, there was a recognition that I'm blessed with community with the two of you, blessed with community at the 456. And I think, I don't know when it was, but there was just this pressing on my heart to like, hey, like learn from your brothers and sisters in Christ. Like you're about to bring a second child into your household, and that's an experience you've never had, but you have brothers and sisters in Christ who have had that experience. Why don't you talk about that? Like, I don't know. I feel like it was an urging from the Lord. I'm not saying that it's right or wrong if you haven't done that or if you don't want to do that. I just know the Lord, I felt the Lord pushing me to do that. And so today's Culture Corner, the more that I've kind of pressed into a longing to embrace the fact that I don't know everything, if that makes sense. I'm realizing just how much of a hindrance that is in most of culture is that they're allowing one thing or another, maybe pride, may it be emotion, may it be something like depression or anxiety, where like they're not wanting to confront the fact that they don't know it all and get advice or thoughts or help from somebody else. Doesn't mean you have to accept every single thing you get from somebody,
right?
But like being open enough to say, I don't know it all and I want to learn. And so I'm desiring through this kind of learning process and growth process to see more of a cultural shift and a cultural change, especially as people of the Lord who have a community built upon the foundation of Christ. I forget, I think it's in 1 John, and you guys can tell me if I'm using this context way wrong, where he's talking about like the elders in the church, the young men in the church, and talking about all these things, talking about how they all interact with each other and how there's like wisdom to be gleaned from the older men. That doesn't change any of who he's not better in Christ because of that, but there's just wisdom to be had. And I might be thinking of a completely different passage. Is that in 1 John?
Say it again.
Where he's talking about the older men, the young men.
1 Timothy 5 for sure.
Oh, okay, cool. So just they're interacting with each other. And so anyway, so I'm longing to see more of a cultural shift of just learning from each other within how do I, the experiences of life, they come about, may it be through families, jobs, whatever, turning to your brothers and sisters in Christ and gleaning from their wisdom, gleaning from their experience in that and learning together. So my question to you guys is now bringing in a second child in the household, what would be maybe a word of encouragement, a word of advice, or what do you think was the biggest shift with bringing a second child into the household?
Well, I have twice as many kids running around the house as you do right now. You're about to have equal. And Micah has twice as many as me, so I default to Micah.
Yeah, but you still have brought a second one in, though.
Yeah.
The Oreo feeling is getting bigger.
While you think about it, I'll say that I've enjoyed with a few people I've talked to and I've asked that question, I've enjoyed the small conversation that comes from it. Because what's great about it is I think in parenting and in marriage, people want to force their opinions upon you. They want to force their thought. Well, you're not raising your kids right. And I think what can be the shift in that conversation is instead of having someone force their opinion on you, you going to someone and saying like, hey, what do you think about this? And I'm not out of being desperate. I know the Lord's got me. I know that like my foundation, my family is built upon the gospel, built upon Christ. And like, even if I had no one else to talk to, we would bring this family into the world and teach Adeline about Jesus. But I have the opportunity to talk to people. Yeah. The opportunity to glean wisdom.
Here's my thought as an encouragement, I think is can be applied not just with another kid, but every kid you add from this point, is that every kid's different.
Very much
so. You have some foundational things as a parent your parents you're trying to instill, which is mostly just like teaching your kids Jesus.
Yeah.
But then every kid's different. I'll give you an example actually with our third one with Grayson. He had these like crazy temper tantrums, like would just go off the rails. Cammy sometimes would have to FaceTime me when I was on the road because he would not settle down. Like if he was mad, he'd be like throwing stuff in his room. He's like a 2-3-year-old.
Yeah.
And she could not get him to chill out. And when she'd FaceTime me, that would do it. Something about that father-son relationship.
There's something to it. Yeah.
So what we figured out later though, is I think Grayson was actually anxious. There was some anxiety happening that we didn't recognize early enough. And when we did later, then it's been beneficial for him now, but like understanding that every kid's different. So I couldn't say, well, like Seth was like really easy. And then honestly, discipline wise, even Aiden was fairly easy too. And then I can't go to my third one and be like, dude, why are you such a terrible, awful kid? Because it's been so easy. The pattern has been so easy. Why are you so hard? You've got to recognize every kid's different. So like, even like the stuff we've talked about with Riley, you can't penalize your second kid because of what Riley has done.
Exactly.
You know what I'm saying?
That's exactly right.
You can't let that be the standard for how you deal with Adeline.
Absolutely.
I echo that. Like my boys are completely different people in what they like and how they behave, how they think. And we noticed that from the time that like Riker was a year old and Asher was 2.5, like we could see differences in their personalities. And and letting each of them be who they are and shape it with Christ.
Yeah.
One of my kids, Aiden, texted Cammy not too long ago because we were letting Grayson watch, I don't know, some movie that they couldn't watch. Seth and Aiden couldn't watch until they were older than what Grayson is now. And Aiden was complaining like, oh, he gets to watch all these movies we couldn't watch till we were younger. And Cammy was like, he's got us. And I responded and I was like, well, tell Aiden, we let you watch Disney Plus whenever you wanted when you were a kid. Grayson can't watch it at all.
Exactly. Yeah.
Of course, Disney wasn't like crazy woke back then either. But damn, But yeah, I think that's like a good one. I think is across the board for all parents, especially even as your kids get older. Like you can't let the experience of one kid dictate the experience of the other kid.
Yeah,
you can have some foundational principles you're doing as parents, but like each kid is so different and how they go, their tendencies and how they go about life, and you've got to let each kid. You got to parent based on each kid's tendencies.
Absolutely, and allowing the singular constant within that to be Christ.
Well, you might have just more natural overlap with one of your kids than another because your personalities are more similar. But I think one of the interesting things is trying to find ways to show each of my boys that they're loved and that they're cared for in a way that makes sense to them.
Yeah, it's conveyed.
That's a good point because they're going to receive that differently.
You know, and their
value systems are different.
I want them to both feel loved and cared for. I want them to feel like they're both. And if I try to associate to both of my boys the exact same way all the time and they're not the same, then it ends up looking like favoritism. And so I want to recognize that they're two different people and that I'm investing in two different ways.
And sometimes you can't get away from that.
Sometimes
As I was thinking too, like, and I don't know, I mean, we've known, I'm sorry, I'm going a little bit longer, but knowing that I've known Adeline, but I haven't held and just talked to and seen Adeline grow. And so like,
she's not a real baby until she gets older.
Right. So
I'm
like
joking, obviously.
Stupid culture.
For those of you that clapped, I'd like to kick you in the nuts.
Yeah, you dummies. Come here. But I know in conversations we've had so much about like Riley's personality, I have a really strong feeling that as she grows older, we might click better as like on the just a friendship type of level,
reasoning perspective.
Like just the way that our minds think, the things that she enjoys doing, like the way where her humor is. Like I know that we'll probably be able to piggyback off each other as she gets older, and that might not be the case with other kids, and so that might look like perceived favoritism and stuff like that, but that doesn't necessarily. So I think being conscious of that, of all of these things, and applying Jesus to whatever that relationship may look like and how their personality.
I think it's a great thought to like remedy that. What you're saying, Ryan, is like recognizing how you can show each kid love from their perspective. That's because I think a lot of parents will do it in one way across the board and assume every kid feels like they're loved and cared for.
Well, and it's also like
good point.
I'm trying to be, I know we're out of time on this, but like I'm trying to.
This is our parenting episode.
We do have a parenting episode.
Intentional in just the way I spend time with them and like and create adventures and create things that each kid can point back to and go like, man, I remember when Dad and I did this. And I don't know. It's fun, man. I really
That is
love,
huge.
I love being a dad.
The experiences thing.
Yeah.
Cami and I talk about that a lot. Like, is it smart financially where we're at to like take our kids snowboarding? No. We're not spending money we don't have. I'm just saying, like, in terms of like, is there a better way to use that money? Yeah. Man,
arguably not.
Arguably not. That's only from a financial perspective.
Yeah,
right? If you're looking at it from the perspective of like parenting and kids and family and experiences, what I'm building into my kids, I don't know if you could put a value on that time together. And so, yeah, there's, I mean, we could probably do like 5 or 6 parenting episodes.
Yeah, for real.
Well, I think on our last one, we said we'll do it again in a year. Like every year.
Which I think we've had the similar feedback about marriage as well.
Yeah.
Of doing more frequent
Doing it
episodes
every
on
year.
marriage. Yeah.
Yep.
Awesome. The marriage. I really appreciate that. And obviously with our community and our growth, like I'll be continually on you guys and talk to y'all through the midst of all that.
I have no idea what to tell you about girls.
That's true.
I got nothing for you.
Yeah.
I am the only girl dad.
You are.
No, you're the expert.
That's right. Oh, that's scary.
When when she's of that age, don't even ask. 'Cause
Yeah.
I don't know what to
That'd be so. Gosh, I wanna stage something for both of you. I'm like,
Yeah.
look what I found. Just send y'all pictures.
I will run.
Oh, hey Ryan, what are we talking about today?
Man, a hard left, aren't we? Like, we're just going boom.
I know. Mid conversation, I was like, well, this is going to get
so happy. Today we are talking about divorce, and this has been on our list for a year and a half probably to talk about. And so today we get to talk about divorce.
We can't put it off any longer.
No.
But Ryan, isn't God always against divorce?
Well, actually, Pierce, the answer is no. The short answer is no. But
what?
Because I think people would look right at 1 Corinthians 7. If you're married to an unbelieving spouse and they leave, I think people would look at Matthew 5 and say if your spouse has committed adultery and you leave. So I think that
God did it with His people.
Yeah, I think that typically, and that's super key to this conversation. Yeah. I think that people typically look at those two examples, and those have been the standards for Christian divorce in sermons that I've heard, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like if you're a Christian, you can't get divorced unless it's one of these two reasons.
Yeah.
And if you Google Christian divorce, you're going to find this. You're going to find article after article after article written. There are 2 allowances for Christian divorce. Mm-hmm. If you become a Christian while married and your unbelieving spouse says, I can't deal with it, I'm out, you're not bound to them, is what Paul says. And then Matthew, if your spouse cheats on you, you're not bound to them. And those would be the 2 things that I think people would say. My view has shifted a lot. And I'm just going to say, look, like this is, whenever you talk about something that's this deeply personal, because for most of us, our parents have been divorced or something, mm-hmm. or as we are getting older, we are knowing more and more people personally who have been through divorce.
Yeah. Or are divorced.
The
person, listening is divorced.
Yeah. And so we know more and more people all the time who are divorced or on the second marriage or third marriage or whatever. And these are questions that are valid questions. Yeah. And people want to know, like, where do I stand with Christ? Where do I stand with God? So at the outset of this conversation, I think it's super important to remind you, really, if you haven't listened to the last couple of weeks, it'd be really good for you to listen to the last couple of weeks before you listen to this, because our identity rests in who Christ is, mm-hmm. not your divorce. And who you are as a follower of Jesus rest in what Christ has done on the cross and the empty tomb.
Yeah.
And so your divorce does not shape you negatively in God's eyes, because God's pleasure with you isn't based on how well you've done at life. It's based mm-hmm. on your faith in Jesus. And mm-hmm. so that's super important. And then the other thing that I think is really important in this conversation is that well, I guess it's the same thing, but like we have to measure ourselves according to the gospel and not according to law. And so my view on this has changed a lot. And I don't feel like I'm done yet. I don't feel like I'm done processing this. And so
we'll do another episode in a year.
Give me 5. But I will say that I used to stand where most of our Christian brothers and sisters will stand, and that is that there are only 2 biblical reasons allowed for divorce. This is where I used to stand. So in case you missed that, this is where I used to stand, that there were only 2 biblical reasons allowed for a divorce: adultery or an unbelieving spouse departing from you. And only under those 2 conditions would you then be allowed to be remarried. And that's how I taught, and that's how I preached. And one of the biggest regrets of my life is a sermon that I preached in 2006, where I preached on divorce at a singles conference.
I remember this,
but it was adult singles. It wasn't young singles, and it was and I read. All I didn't exposit at all. All I did was read every single text from the Bible that dealt with divorce, and so inevitably, what I ended up doing was presenting a law view of divorce without a gospel view, without the grace of Jesus in the mix.
Yeah,
and of course, people were crushed, and other people were angry, and other people were like, yeah, because they were good law people or whatever. Regardless, my perspective on it was not through the lens of Christ. It was through the lens of the law. And so it was wrong, and I was wrong. So a couple of things that we need to consider. One, everybody says God hates divorce. Everybody says that. Not everybody. That's an exaggeration. I don't say that anymore. A lot of people say God hates divorce, and they quote Malachi 2, and they quote verse. Hey, my eyes are tired. Verse 16, and it's interesting because some translations render it that God hates divorce. Some translations, like this is the ESV, Malachi 2:16 says, "For the man who does not love his wife but divorces her and hates her, says the Lord, the God of Israel, covers his garment with violence." So there's this idea. So one translation says that for the man who does not love his wife but divorces her, hates her, says the Lord, and covers himself with violence. Another translation, maybe the NIV, says, for the man who does not love his wife but divorces her, or God says, I hate divorce. So some people make it the statement that God says he hates divorce, and some people make it the statement that the man who divorces his wife has hated his wife, which is why he divorced her. And what's interesting is in the Greek, it probably is the man. And it's probably the man because in Deuteronomy, when it's talking about divorce, don't hold me to Deuteronomy, but I'm pretty sure it's Deuteronomy, where he says that if a man and a woman are joined and he decides he hates her and puts her away, so it's a reference to the law. So the only verse in the entire Bible that is sometimes translated as God hates divorce was probably translated as God hates divorce to accommodate a position that the editors already had.
Yeah.
Because in the Hebrew, it's the hate is attached to the husband who has tired of his wife.
I was going to say, contextually, it seems like the context is like with the divorce is with the intention of marrying another.
Right.
And so it's like, you can't just pull that out of context and say,
you have
God
been
hates divorce.
Unfaithful with the wife of your youth.
Yeah.
How have we been unfaithful? You've covered my altar with tears, and he has made them one with the portion of the Spirit in their union. And so, and that's exactly in accordance with the law.
Yep.
If a man hates his wife and sends her away and he marries another, he can't take his wife back to him. So Malachi is addressing the law, and not that God hates divorce. It's saying that the man who divorces his wife, according to the law, has hated his wife, and that's why he's sending her away. Yeah. He's no longer pleased with her. So the one verse in the Bible that people have used a lot and said, look, God hates divorce, don't you know? It says in Malachi, is probably, and I'm going to say, is absolutely not saying God hates divorce. It's
universally.
Yeah, it's a text about the law and the workings of the law. And if you read through Malachi, all of this in Malachi is dealing with the sinfulness of the people of Israel and all of their failures. They're failing in a lot of different ways. Now, the other thing that's really interesting, and Micah, you've already mentioned it, is that God writes his people a certificate of divorce.
Yep.
And this is addressed for us in Jeremiah and Isaiah, that God wrote a certificate of divorce to the people of Israel. He does that. And so I would find it very difficult to say that God, I would find it impossible to say that God is going to do something that is contrary to his nature.
Yeah.
Right? And so he divorces his adulterous people because they're serving other gods.
I've heard people answer that. I don't agree with them. Is they'll say that he didn't do it.
Right.
That he just wrote it.
Because he took back his wife.
like even use that as a context. If
The-
it was,
The problem is that most people who make that argument are thinking from a Western mindset of marriage and divorce rather than the
Jewish
Hebrew perspective of marriage and divorce, because a betrothed couple who is not yet married, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 7, just stay betrothed. Which is a weird thing because legally they'd have to be divorced to be separated, but they're also not completely married. And so, but they're kind of married. Those people are arguing from a Western mindset rather than a Jewish mindset. Now, so not only does God divorce his adulterous people, so of course people are going to say, well, yeah, the Bible allows you to divorce the adulterer. But the other thing is this, and this is really interesting. And this is from Ezra. You can find it in Ezra and Nehemiah. But when the people of God are returning from captivity and they're coming back to Jerusalem, God is rebuking them through Ezra, and Ezra is mad at the people and he weeps over it and he's pulling out the hair of his beard. Nehemiah is mad at the people for the same thing and he's pulling out their beards, which is so funny.
Which is basically the Old Testament term of kicking them in the nuts.
Right, yeah. And so that's a t-shirt we need for Simpler because it's every episode. Every episode, somebody's getting kicked in the nuts. And so
we should have there used to be this shirt back in the day. Sorry, side note. I wanted to get a Target and Kim was like, where are you going to wear that? You can't get it.
With the
and
squirrel?
Hold the squirrel and the acorn to protect your nuts. We should get someone like holding the scripture or something.
Yeah.
Like teaching it correctly, protect your nuts.
Yeah. So these people have returned from captivity in Babylon. And it's super interesting because I misread this for a long time. And they are being rebuked for the wives that they have taken. And they're not being rebuked for the Babylonian wives because through the prophet Jeremiah, God actually tells them, intermarry with the Babylonians, intermarry with the people that I'm sending you to. They have intermarried with Canaanite women in Babylon, okay? And the Bible, God has expressly forbidden them back in Exodus, Exodus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. He has forbidden them from intermarrying with the Canaanites. And so in Ezra chapter 9, he says, he goes, you were told not to intermarry with the people of the land. These are an abomination, and you've intermarried with these people. This is Ezra 9:11. Verse 12, therefore do not give your daughters for their sons, and neither take their daughters for your sons, and never seek their peace, and never seek their prosperity, that you may be strong and eat the good of the land, and leave it for an inheritance to your children. So this is talking about Israel God has forbidden them from intermarrying with these pagan nations that had lived in Canaan. And so chapter 10 says Ezra was praying and he's weeping and he's making confession and a great assembly of people gather around. And then they say in verse 2, Ezra 10:2, we have broken faith with our God. We have married foreign women, specifically the Canaanite women is what it's talking about, from the peoples of the land. But even now there is hope for Israel in spite of this. Therefore, let us make a covenant with our God and put away all of our wives and all other children according to the counsel of the Lord and those who tremble at the command of our God, and let it be done according to the law. So God sends Ezra to deal with this sin of the people of God marrying people he has forbidden them from marrying. And the solution to that is divorce. And this is not the non-believers departing from the believers. This is not that. This is God going, these were people you are not allowed to marry.
Yeah.
Send them away. And not just send away your wives, send away the kids you've had with these wives too. And so people are going to go, well, how do we translate that to modern day America? We don't. This is not a one-to-one correlation to marriages in America. This is a specific thing that God has dealt with the people of Israel. But I'm using it to point out that here is another place. So not only does God divorce his people and then takes his bride back, and it's key, according to the Jewish law, the reason that God is allowed to take his people back is because he never joined himself to another people, according to Jewish law. So he's set up the law, he's set up the standard. And then here in Ezra, he is giving another case for divorce. Like
your point with these is that you can't take the Malachi verse, God hates divorce, and then fit it with
a mistranslation of the Malachi verse.
Yeah.
And then, because here are two places, one where God divorced Israel and one where he commands the Israelites to be divorced,
right?
Where the divorce is according to the will of God.
All you're trying to do is kick the axiom we've always had in our thinking about divorce out from underneath us.
Yeah, I'm trying to. So we've propped up divorce with a false conversation.
We're not making a case right. You're not making a case right now for a certain stance on divorce yet.
No.
All you've done so far is you're just trying to step back and help us rethink about how we look at the word and the usage of the concept of divorce.
Right.
Then we can foundationally move forward.
Absolutely. So what we've done in the past is we've said God hates divorce, the end.
Mm-hmm.
And then we've added in Matthew 5, unless your spouse commits adultery.
Right.
And then we've added in 1 Corinthians 7, unless your unbelieving spouse departs from you. Yeah. And we've added those two in. So that's been those were my 3 texts.
Mm-hmm.
And based on those 3 texts, every other time the Bible talked about divorce, I filtered them through those 3 texts.
Right.
And what we need to do to understand the text more holistically is we have to be fair, first of all, to the text and recognize that Malachi 2:16 is probably not saying God hates divorce. It's probably saying the man who divorces hates and covers himself with violence,
Mm-hmm.
declares the Lord. Mm-hmm. And then also see that there was a place where God divorced Israel, and then God has commanded Israel to divorce themselves from the Canaanites. And so there were places that divorce existed in line with God's purpose, right?
Mm-hmm.
And his will. And so, again, I'm not ready to make I don't know if I can make definitive statements on this. I will say that one of the things that I did in the last few years is I actually counseled someone to get divorced, which 20-year-old Ryan and 30-year-old Ryan and early 40-year-old Ryan would not have done. And
I remember that.
And it was
I do remember that.
It was a situation where,
can I make a side note real quick?
yeah,
you're not saying, or correct me if I'm wrong,
please.
You're not saying that we used to call it a caveat in 1 Corinthians. I think Peter mentions it as well.
I think so.
About if you
remain with the unbelieving spouse. Yeah, Peter mentions it too.
We're not saying that caveat goes away.
Mm-mm.
That's not what we're saying at all. You're just,
no.
Your point was like, we used to only use those passages.
Those were the only 2 excuses.
So like,
yeah.
If there's, which I think was the situation you're talking about.
Yeah.
Where there's a woman who was married to an unbeliever.
Yeah.
Who was treating her incredibly badly.
Yeah.
Very, very badly. And you said
it wasn't a safe environment. It wasn't a good environment.
So point being, no matter where you land on the divorce, not you, but like in general, wherever people land on the divorce topic, it would be difficult to debate the Corinthians and Peter perspective of like, if you're a believer who's married to a non-believer, however that happened.
Yeah.
And then the unbelieving husband leaves, or that where we're at now, that relationship needs to be severed.
Yeah.
Which is what's different about how you counseled that than you would have 20 years ago.
Right.
It's a believer married to a non-believer. You probably 20 years ago would have said you need to stay with him until, and now you're saying you need to be out of that relationship because your perspective before was founded on probably a misinterpretation of Malachi.
Yes.
And a misinterpretation of Matthew.
Yes. Yeah.
Right?
So one of the things that I think doesn't get talked about enough when we have a conversation about divorce is the purpose of marriage.
Yep.
Which we've talked about a lot. And so the purpose of marriage is the representation of the husband representing Christ, Ephesians 5, and the wife representing the church, Ephesians 5, and that to image God, Genesis 1, and to image the relationship even that the individual and then holistically the church has with Christ. Like it is conveying the story of Jesus.
I've never understood why the divorce conversation is elevated above the what is marriage supposed to be conversation.
Yeah. Right.
Like, for example, let's at least admit this right now. I think this is what all 3 of us are saying. We don't specifically have a specific stance on divorce. Like, I mean, like,
it's different than it used to be.
Yes, but
it's not based on the law.
We're not making a definitive statement on like in here's the situations where it's okay and not. We're not making a statement at all.
I think that's law. I think to do that we'd have to come back to a law.
Totally agree. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So like, I think that what's funny is in the situation where you're talking about you counseled this woman and you said you should just get divorced. People would probably, and maybe right now, are like, that's stupid, Ryan. Why would you tell someone to get divorced? Well, that's elevating divorce above the purpose of marriage. So if she's in a marriage where it's impossible for her to fulfill God's intention and purpose of marriage, specifically now as Ephesians 5 people, like people who can fulfill the Ephesians 5 perspective of marriage, why does the divorce thing get elevated above that? I don't understand. Like biblically, if you take out Malachi, if you take out Matthew, in terms of like saying, these are foundational for the perspective of divorce. And we're saying you have to take those out in terms of us now because they're law-based perspectives.
Right.
If you take those out, how is it that divorce or not getting divorced is elevated above the purpose of marriage? Like, why would you tell this woman, continue to live in a marriage where it's impossible for you to do what God has intended for you to do in marriage for the sake of not disobeying the law,
which essentially to me is what's happening in Ezra. Like they've married Canaanite people, and it is impossible in that marriage to fulfill what God has called them to do.
Right.
It's directly contrary to what God has called them to do.
Mm-hmm.
But what we've done historically as a church is we've said, well, too late, you're in it. And so we say you can't get divorced because you're in it, instead of saying this is 100% contrary to who God is.
Why do we feel like the law has different weight than other parts of the law?
I know.
So like, why would I tell someone, even if I was going to take a law perspective of Malachi and Matthew, why would I tell someone, don't get divorced, but eat shellfish?
Right. Yeah. If you break any part of the law, you've broken the whole thing. And if you want to observe any part of the law, you have to observe the whole
thought.
thing.
Yeah. So like we elevate this law perspective.
Yeah.
And somehow it's primary to God's intention for marriage.
Which is honestly why so many people, and I've heard this over and over and over for 25 years in churches, why so many people who are divorced feel like stepchildren in the church.
Mm-hmm.
They feel missed, they feel overlooked, they feel looked down upon because they've gotten divorced.
Mm-hmm.
And because the church as a whole has elevated, it's almost like the Protestant church has become the Catholic church, where this is one of the sacraments for your salvation. Like this is one of the things you have to do to be saved.
Wow.
You know, because we almost treat it with that same kind of weight. And the reality is that like Matthew 19, somebody's going to throw Matthew 19 in my face. Look, like throw all the verses in my face. I'm prepared for this conversation, but I'm also ready to have it. Like I'm ready to.
If there's something we're missing,
I'm
we're
ready
happy
to. I'm ready to flesh this out. But in Matthew 19, what God has joined together, let no one put apart. I agree with that, but the stipulation there is what God has joined together.
Yeah, because
and the assumption is that every marriage license that's been handed out is a marriage that God has joined together, and that's garbage.
Nope.
Yeah.
That is garbage, because you'll notice that the standard for marriage was a standard for the people of Israel and not a standard for any of the other nations.
Yep.
Because God wasn't trying to make a standard about marriage universally. He was trying to make a standard of marriage about those who had faith in him and who knew him.
Which is what we just talked about in our marriage episode.
Yeah.
Since the inception of marriage in Genesis 2, it's always been about a reflection of the relationship between God and his people, specifically now between Jesus and the church.
Yeah.
When we miss that and elevate divorce, then we've missed the concept.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and the reality is that divorce is the result. Correct me, but I feel like 100% of the time we can say that divorce is the result of some sort of sin. And the reason that I feel that way is because universally, biblically speaking, there is an intent for marriage.
Mm-hmm.
And so if somebody doesn't know Jesus and they're getting married, they're missing the universal part of that, right? Yeah. And then the Christians who I've done a lot of counseling with Christians who they didn't understand that their marriage was intended to be a gospel representation of Christ. And so they approached marriage from the standpoint of, I'm going to do the best I can to love you. You do the best you can to love me. And if we tick each other off, we tick each other off. And I would say that is a low view of God, a low view of marriage. There's something off. Like divorce is usually the result of there being something off in God's intent for marriage.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
But, and I have plenty of friends who were married and then divorced before they were ever Christians, and their marriage now proclaims God. I have friends who were married as Christians, but they didn't have a correct view of marriage, and their marriage tanked because if you're trying to uphold a godly marriage according to the law, it's going to tank. It's at least going to be miserable. Like, how many Christians are married but miserable and they're staying together because of the law? And look, I'm not an advocate for divorce. I don't think divorce is the answer.
We should be clear on that.
Yeah. I don't think that divorce is the solution to a problem marriage.
No, because if you're two believers that are married, then
the Holy
we can
Spirit,
work through that.
Yeah, the Holy Spirit is at work in you. God's grace is bigger than your failures.
Yeah.
And so we advocate for restoration and healing in marriage is what but what I would argue is that I have seen too many people that God has used gloriously because it took them, like one of my buddies, he died years ago of cancer, but when I met him, he was on his third marriage when I met him. And they had, a phenomenal marriage. And the ways that they loved God together and they served God together and their family served God together and they served the church. And when he would talk about his previous marriages, he would talk about his shortcomings. He would talk about his shortcomings.
Yeah.
Not that there weren't any, I don't know the ex-wives, not that there weren't shortcomings there, but he would talk about his low view of marriage, his low view of God, and he would put the blame fully on himself. But he's also not trying to hold himself to the Jewish law.
Yep.
You know, Paul talks about being reconciled. Like he says that if a woman and a husband are separated, they should be reconciled. And that would be our hope for people. But I also like, it's so interesting. I don't know. I always think of this woman down in Ozona that we knew way back in the day. And
that's a long time
yeah,
ago.
and she was married. No, not Ozona. Carrizo Springs, even longer ago.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
No, Ozona was first for us.
It was. That's right. You're right. But she was married to a non-believer, and she was a believer, and she served the Lord, served the church, served the community. And one day her husband came to her and said, look, you're spending too much time volunteering at the church with the youth. I need you to quit doing that. And in her mind, God hasn't commanded her to be a youth worker. God has commanded her to honor her husband and love the Lord. And so she goes, okay. And he was like, you can still go to church on Sundays, but you need to be home right after that because, and part of it was, you're not here to cook meals with me anymore. You're not here to spend time with me anymore. Like that's taking too much of your time. And so she submitted to her husband. And I think somebody could have made the case and probably did to her, like, your husband doesn't believe, just leave him, based on 1 Corinthians and Peter. But he was willing to still live with her. So she stayed with him and she loved him well. And after like 6 or 8 months, he had bumped into somebody out and about, small town, bumped into somebody out and about. And he had asked how the youth were and how the things at the church were. And they're like, well, we don't have a youth pastor because he just got deployed again and da-da-da-da. And he was like, oh man. And he went home and he told his wife, he goes, you got to get back up there. They need you, you know? And so she was someone who chose to stay with her husband and she's loved him well and she cared for him well. And she was a follower of Christ.
Yeah.
So like, I
also, such a cool story. I don't think there was a necessity for her to submit.
Yeah.
Because the only instruction for that would be amongst the believers, like submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. So I just to clarify, I don't want to put that.
No.
I don't want anybody to think that you're like making the Ephesians 5 concept for people who are married to unbelievers.
But her perspective of it was like, because some people would say, well, God told me to help the youth. Yeah, maybe. But like her concern was for her husband's salvation. And her aim was like, I want to represent Christ for my husband.
For him to know Jesus.
Yeah. And so she was like, this is a way that I can serve my husband with the gospel in mind for him, you know, which was a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. It's not an explanation of Ephesians 5. That's a different thing altogether. But I think what we've done is we've taken Matthew 5, we've taken 1 Corinthians 7, and we've taken Malachi 2, and we have made a standard for marriage and divorce that is based on the law and not based on God's intent for marriage. And I
imagine that's why people that are divorced feel like they're like the stepchildren.
Yeah.
I imagine there's part of that too, that they feel
because there's no way to ever quit being a lawbreaker.
Yep. I was gonna say that they feel like they're in a constant place of like they're probably self-deprecating to some degree because they feel like they've messed up.
Well,
from a wrong perspective.
I have a really good friend back in the day who she and her husband were both each other's second marriage. I didn't meet them until golly, there wasn't a couple in my life at this point. This was in my early 20s. There wasn't a couple in my life that was more influential than them. I mean, full of grace. They had their home open to people all the time, loved Jesus. And there were people in their lives who were saying to them that, well, you guys are adulterers, because you have been married and are divorced and now remarried to each other. And so what people would do is they would say, well, you're guilty because you're divorced and now you're an adulterer because you're remarried. And they're taking, I think, Matthew 5 out of context. Yep. We can talk about that sometime. I don't know. We can talk about it now. I just don't know that it's
I don't think it's
necessary.
We've talked about Matthew 5 already. They can go back and listen.
And so the thing about that that's really interesting is like, the only standard by which you would say you continue to be guilty is a standard of law and not Christ.
Yep.
And so, look, is divorce painful? I think divorce is painful for kids. I think
it's awful for the families.
Yeah, I think kids that are having to divide their attention between mom and dad, I think that's hard. And oftentimes there's so much hurt between
adults.
Yeah,
I dealt with that 100% early on in marriage.
But I think also
trying to split time with her parents.
Yeah, but also like this idea that there are some people who are really hurt from divorce, and then they ask their kids to pick sides.
Mm.
And they poison kids against, like, there's, even if you divorce well, it hurts.
It's still not good.
Because the biblical intent of marriage was to show the unity of Christ and his people.
Yeah.
And so here's what's really interesting to me, is in the Old Testament, yes, God divorced Israel. In the New Testament, those who are joined to Christ, the bride of Christ, there is no divorce.
Can't happen.
It cannot happen. You cannot be separated from God. And so I think that some people make that an analogy and say that's why you should never get divorced. And look, marriage is intended to be a correct picture of the gospel. And I do think divorce does harm to the picture of the gospel. Yep. But I also think a marriage that stays together but doesn't look like Jesus does damage to the gospel.
Right.
Yeah. And how do you say that one is better than the other?
So you're not, just to be clear, you're not actually making a case for one or the other.
No.
Because I think people are going to take you as saying that. So really where we land, I think all three of us, is that God has an intention and purpose for marriage.
Yeah. Which is why divorce is painful.
Right. Even little side note, even people who aren't people who've put faith in Jesus, divorce is still painful because there's an essence of marriage, even if it's not between two people of faith, that has some imagery of what it's supposed to be.
Well, the very first marriage ever was a covenant created by God to image him.
Right. Yeah. And so anytime
there is a spiritual element to it, whether people agree with that or not.
Right. Even tearing that apart at all is painful. But I think where we all three land is God's intention and purpose for marriage is to reflect the relationship God has with his people, or specifically now Jesus has with his bride, with the body of Christ. And so like if anybody comes to us that are believers that are struggling through marriage, I cannot think of a time ever, and probably will ever, where we will tell those people we think the best option for you is divorce. What we would do is we would walk with them through it and continue to push 100%. Them. Because what we believe is that if you have put faith in Jesus, the Spirit lives in both of you, and there is you are able to have reconciliation. You're able to have forgiveness. We've seen it. We've seen marriages restored from chaos. We've seen it. So our intention is never to go, well, you screwed up, just give up and start over.
Yeah.
But what we're saying is that
because the redemptive work of God is bigger than that.
Yes. What we're saying is we don't approach divorce now from the perspective of if you've been divorced, you are morally wrong or an adulterer. What we're saying is like if people, it's happened. I don't think it's ever happened to me where someone comes that has been divorced and is remarried.
Yeah.
The instruction you don't give people is, well, you suck. So just deal with it the rest of your life. Know that you're an adulterer. Just like do the best you can. Your instruction to them is, listen, regardless of your past, now you have this marriage relationship with this other person. Live like the Ephesians 5 people.
And honestly, what I do is, because I've had these conversations dozens of times, is I'll say, look, let's acknowledge that something in your first marriage went awry. Let's acknowledge that there was something about your first marriage that didn't image Christ. Let's figure out what that was so that in this marriage we can image Jesus.
Yeah.
Like let it be a growing point, albeit painful growing point, but let it be a point where we go, okay, look, how was I approaching marriage that wasn't in step with Jesus?
Yeah.
Because a lot of times, like it's very difficult not to approach marriage from a selfish perspective. It's very difficult to not do that. And it takes deliberate intention, anyway. So what I do is I go, look, all right, this is the marriage you're in now. Let's honor Jesus today.
Let's move forward.
Yeah. And so,
because the goal, like I said earlier, still the ultimate goal is to have a marriage relationship that reflects this relationship that Jesus has with the church.
Well, when my parents divorced, I was 23, and I told my mom, I was like, well, you can't get remarried without being an adulteress. and of course, my dad was an adulterer. And so like...
I thought you were about to say my dad was an adulteress.
So he may have been. Who knows? Just kidding. But it was one of those things that, like, from the biblical perspective, people would be like, well, he committed adultery, and so she's free from that. And I was still pretty hard-nosed about that for a long while, and even said that I wouldn't do a wedding for people who had previously been married and divorced. And that changed. I did my first wedding like that a couple of weeks ago. And but it's one of these things that I'm like, look, like, am I measuring people according to the gospel or measuring them according to Christ? And if somebody comes to me and they're mean and they're hateful and they burn a bridge with me, and then they come back later looking for reconciliation with me, it's just a friendship, right? And they come back looking for reconciliation with me, am I going to hold them according to the law, or am I going to hold them according to the standard of Christ? And I hope what I will do is I won't go, well, screw you, you burn that bridge and we're done. What I hope I will do is go, look, man, isn't it great that in Christ there's repentance, and isn't it great in Christ there's restoration, and so people who would come to me and go, man, my first marriage failed, but I really want to knock this one out of the park. I want to make sure. And I'm like, man, isn't it great that our past failures don't have to mean future failures, and that the grace of God is big enough to help us to honor Him in our marriage. And I think that there are so many people. I want us as a human Christian people, I want us to be okay.
Human Christian people.
Yeah, well, I was going to say,
what is a woman?
Yes.
I was going to say as a human race, but this is really
you.
Specifically Christian. I want us as Christians to quit being so fearful of acknowledging our failure and come to the place where we go, look, I own it. This period of my life, or this moment in my life, or this thing in my life was failure. Thanks be to God.
Absolutely.
For His grace. That I saw a deal the other day. It was like famous people, normal people who went to high school with famous people. And it was super funny because some of these stories that people were going like, and so-and-so was a jerk in 10th grade. and it's like, okay, but they're a 60-year-old singer now, like one of them was Bon Jovi or something. It was like Bon Jovi shoved me in my locker when we were in, elementary school. And I'm like, oh, okay, but should that shape him now? Like, should that shape how we view him today?
Absolutely.
Maybe he's still shoving people in their lockers, but probably not. You know what I mean?
I don't know there's lockers like that outside of school.
He just goes to the school like,
I guess I said like
whenever he's on tour
around with him.
He's gonna be at the gym or something like that.
But you know what I mean? Like everybody's so quick to. It's the canceling of Paula Deen a few years back because of something she said 10 years earlier. And we do that all the time. No one allows anyone to grow or change anymore. Our culture doesn't allow for that. And I think that the church has treated divorce the same way. This divorce you had 10 years ago has shaped how the church views you indefinitely. Instead of going, are you kidding me? Look, like let's own it and say there was something in our marriage that was wrong. To this day, I'll still say this until I'm proven wrong, but I don't ever believe divorce is 100% somebody's fault. I have seen it where I was like, man, that's a 98.2%, and maybe a 99.1%, but like typically there is something that is a contributing factor from both parties.
Can we be more clear? Not more clear. Can we go more detailed on that? Because I think that it looks a little different from different perspectives. Like if it's two people that are believers, then a marriage that's one believer and one unbeliever, and then two unbelievers. Yeah. So like in the situation with two believers, always the situation is their marriage is not founded on like this perspective of reflecting Jesus in the church. Yeah. Always. So that's the issue in marriages amongst Christians. Yep. Then in the next detail.
Whatever that has manifested itself.
Yeah, however it has.
The problem is your low view of Christ in marriage.
Yeah, and you could say it. You could say it all day long like, well, no, that's what we know. I've had people sit in my living room, kitchen technically, and say, no, we know this is the case. And then I told them, don't get married because you both are incredibly stubborn and you're like the worst at communicating I've ever met in my life. Don't get married. But I didn't have any reason to tell him. In retrospect, I should have been like, okay, I can't do this. But like told them not to get married, and because they sucked at communication. And then they had this awful marriage for a few years and they got divorced. And yeah, they knew it. They said it. Like, we know this is the purpose of marriage. But it's one thing to know it. It's a whole other thing to like live that. Yeah. So then the next detail will be like someone who's a believer married to a non-believer. Yeah. Your marriage can't reflect the relationship between Jesus and the church. So as Peter says, the goal then is if you're in that marriage, show Jesus to your spouse with the hope that they'll put faith in Jesus.
To give some hope to the believer in that scenario, I would argue that the believer, male or female, can reflect their part of that. Like if it's a husband, they can still love their unbelieving wife like Christ loves that person.
How?
I'm not saying it's going to be easy. I'm just saying,
I mean, like even like contextually, how, like biblically, how
does a Christian love a non-Christian?
Like, why would you take that principle into a marriage that can't fulfill that?
I see what you're saying.
I don't know if I think that's a slippery slope you don't want to go down.
Okay. Why?
Because then you'd almost have to say like the law then could apply to us.
Oh, gotcha.
Then you'd have to go back on everything you just said in the episode. I think what you're actually probably trying to say is you could love your spouse with the same heart to see them Jesus. You can't love them like Christ loved the church. Like it's impossible.
Because they're not the church.
Impossible.
Gotcha.
So I don't even know if I'd take that principle and say, I don't think you would counsel them any different than you would to someone who has a kid that's a non-believer.
Yeah.
Love them.
Show them love.
Unconditionally. Show them the love of God.
Yeah. Is this a person for whom Christ died?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
show them that love.
So what we can say is that the believer in the party, because you're right, the non-believer can't be the church.
Mm-mm.
So what we would say is the believer in that party, then their home is a mission field, and you're showing this person the love of Christ.
Absolutely.
And you can do that well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It might not be enough to save your marriage if the person is
right
done.
I also wouldn't say, this is maybe the shift for us and maybe more so a shift for me, even though it feels so weird to say this. I'm not sure I can make a case biblically that it would be wrong for the believer to divorce the unbeliever, except that Peter says don't.
Yeah.
But I think what Peter's saying contextually, like from the cultural context, is like they weren't trying to get divorced.
Right.
What he was saying was, if they leave, you're free.
Right.
But that's, I mean, think about who Peter's writing to.
Right.
This group of Jews probably who are spread out. So like their cultural perspective, the Jewish cultural perspective is that you don't leave marriage.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
And so I don't know if you can make like a universal principle of that.
Well, you can't make a case for divorce there. You can make a case like freedom from the, I don't know.
That you're, yeah. So again, that's
his argument's not for divorce.
Right. So kind of what we're saying is divorce is messy. We don't really have what we're saying is what we used to believe about it being like this law-based perspective.
Yeah, can't do that.
Can't do that. What we're not saying is we're advocates for divorce.
And what we can't say from the Bible is that God hates divorce.
Right.
Because of the examples in the prophets and in Ezra, and that there were times that it was commanded, or at least one time where it was commanded by God.
Right.
And so what we can do is say that there is a biblical intent of marriage, and that not every marriage does that.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're two Christians, I mean, look, if I would have a hard time, I don't know, but like if it's an abusive situation, if it's a violent situation, you got to get out. Like for your safety, for your kids' safety.
And I think where we're probably still at, correct me if I'm wrong between you two, we probably haven't had this conversation, but I'm still not sure if I would counsel two Christians to get divorced even in an abusive situation. I would tell the one spouse to leave.
Oh, they 100% have to leave.
Not divorce.
Right.
Yeah. And because if we believe they're both believers, then we still believe that there could be
there's hope.
The hope of reconciliation. Yeah. So I don't think we would ever counsel someone to get divorced in a situation, even something extreme like abuse.
Yeah. But get out. Don't
get
stay
out
there.
And then what I would like, and this is a shift for us. Like, let's just say, because it's usually the wife in that situation. If the wife, in that situation, we counseled her, said, you need to get out. Like, take the kids. If you have kids, go somewhere else. Go stay with family. Just be away from your husband. And then if he divorces her, here's what's different for us. We don't tell her now you're tainted and you would commit adultery moving in another relationship, which we used to.
We used to say that.
We would have said you need to stay single the rest of your life, and now we're not saying that.
No.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It cannot be. It's interesting to me how, even though we know, the three of us know that our lives are measured by the gospel and not the law, it is interesting to me how many old Protestant kind of Baptist views I go, yeah, but the law, like, oh yeah, but, and we can't. Here's where we're at today: is we refuse to measure divorce according to the law, and we do so super clearly. There is a biblical intent for marriage. It is to picture the gospel of Christ, to show Christ and his love for the church. Two believers have every resource at their disposal, albeit maybe don't realize they do or don't understand or whatever, but have every resource at their disposal to have a marriage that glorifies God. And that would be our first aim for anybody where both parties confess to be Christians. And for somebody who is a Christian who is in a peaceable situation where they're not in danger, but married to a non-believer, then we would say, man, show them the love of Christ and love them well. And like it's, I don't know. And then for those of you who are divorced, and you're like, man, can I ever be remarried? Yeah. And what we would encourage you to do is in your next one, make it your last one. And from the outset, decide that this marriage is going to be about the proclamation of Jesus, and spend some time with somebody who doesn't love the law but loves the gospel, to prepare you and your future spouse for that next marriage so that they can help frame it for you so that you can enjoy and delight in one another and according to the gospel. But there's freedom there and there's liberty there. And I don't know. It's a hard deal because I know that the comments that we'll get on this will be law-based and some Hebrew scholar is going to rip us for Malachi 2, but like, it's still a conversation I need to have with you. Like, because
some Hebrew scholar needs to argue with the other Hebrew scholars,
right,
who are saying the opposite of what that's, And
so it's one of those things. I mean, what you're going to have to do first is give me an answer for God divorcing his people and give me an answer for Ezra. Yeah. Before we can even have this conversation.
I think you can go to the law first. Like, the last episode, wasn't the last episode? Grace and law?
Yeah.
To be consistent, if you're gonna make, to use Paul's word, if you're gonna obey one piece of the law, you gotta obey the whole thing.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So if you were gonna be someone who is gonna say, like, according to the law, you can't get divorced,
right?
Then you have to say every other part of the law, the things I live. So you got to have the same veracity for all the other stuff in the law as you do with divorce.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Good luck.
What's funny is, like, I know from our perspective, like, this conversation helps clean up a view on divorce and helps us see a lot more clearly scripturally, a lot more, helps us make more clear stances, or not as hard, fast stances is probably a better way to say it. But this is probably the first time ever where, like, we've gotten to the end of the episode and I'm striving to summarize it. And I will say, like, you guys may feel like this is more complicated, but it's actually a lot more simple. This is the first time. This is a real complicated, where, like, it stays complicated. But
it does.
But what's crucial for us is, like, I think on the broader scope of simpler, like with keeping Christ as core, we don't need to hold fast to stances that are rooted in either misunderstanding of the text or rooted in a law that we're no longer under. Yeah. And so the simpler view being, like, uphold who you are in Christ, back to identity, acknowledge what Christ has done, back to law versus grace. And in the midst of that, we can't bring a cultural viewpoint, a law viewpoint, or anything else to apply towards something like divorce. We have to view from the lens of Jesus. And what we said at the very beginning as well is that if we're going to talk divorce, we have to talk about marriage. Right. And we have to elevate marriage and a proper view of marriage above that entire conversation. And that's what the lens that we have to understand, even going into the conversation. So simplifying the means by which we approach such a hard topic emotionally, scripturally, like even acknowledge, or like just living out the Christian life, it's a very hard topic in general. So
it is hard.
So cleaning up the way that we might approach it.
And for those of you, I'm not going to apologize for the whole church but for those of you that I personally offended because of my legalistic view of these things in past years, for those of you that I was hard to and did not show you the love of Christ, I'm sorry, because man, I'm rooting for you, and I want to see you make much of Jesus, and I hope to hear how that's happening, and so anyway,
it is so funny. Just thought about this.
That is funny.
That I hear more about divorce. Like, I hear more preachers, pastor friends, I'll say it that way, talk about their stance on divorce than I do hear them talk about their stance on marriage. And I'm not talking about the stance of, like, who should get married. Like, I'm talking about the biblical perspective of what it's supposed to be like.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That is interesting. That almost feels to me like that's been a ploy of the enemy.
Oh, sure.
Because imagine what it'd be like if most of the people in the world who were believers and married actually painted a picture of the relationship Jesus has with his church. Right. And the gospel is actually seen through those marriages. Because then that's going to be replicated in your kids, probably, because they're going to see a good example. Right. You both have said that. Like, you didn't know what marriage was supposed to look like. It wasn't exemplified for you.
Sure.
Yeah.
I did.
Yeah.
I'm not saying I'm a great,
lover?
Husband. If you take sex out of that context, I'm not sure I am a great lover. Like, you guys can say that. Like,
that's what you're saying.
I'm not someone that, like, I don't think a lot of people, maybe Cammy included, like, feel like I would be a great lover. You know what I mean? Like, in that sense, like, I hope that she feels loved. I hope she feels loved. But, like, you know what I'm saying? Like, when you think of great lover, you think of someone who's, like, always doting and, like, oh, that's just not, it's not in my tendencies. You know what I'm saying? So, like, but I feel like,
except for that's nuance, because you're not great at demonstrating compassion, but you actually love people very deeply.
Yes. It just looks different than what culture. But I had it exemplified in a great way, which means it's easier for me to go into marriage and replicate. That's what I'm saying. Like, imagine what would happen if people actually talked about marriage
correctly,
as highlighted, and divorce was like this really small side topic.
Yeah.
What would happen is the gospel would be presented more because marriages would be better.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it's a ploy of the enemy. Now that I think about it, we've spent so much time and effort and emotion on divorce and hating divorce, and from a perspective that's not even probably a biblical perspective.
Exactly. Yeah.
I'm not saying I'm an advocate for divorce. I think divorce sucks. I hate it.
Well, and we have people. Yeah, it's devastating. Divorce, but we have people in our churches who have been divorced and remarried who are making beautiful. They are representing Christ beautifully.
Yeah, they're doing amazing.
And they have been made to feel small because of a single legal standard.
Yeah.
Rather than, like, I mean, at some point we need to talk about, like, that it has nothing to do with a marriage certificate and a divorce certificate. It has everything to do with God's intent. Like, that marriage isn't about a piece of paper. And so, like, it's just, I don't know, man. I just legalism produces pride, and legalism produces condemnation. Those are the two end places. And I just, man, God's grace is bigger, and that has to be the thing that we magnify.
Absolutely.
I would say a simpler viewpoint of divorce is that God's intention for marriage is to reflect Jesus and the relationship Jesus has with the church.
Absolutely.
I feel like that's the context you got to put it in.
Yeah. And if you're in your second marriage, do that.
Yeah.
Make much of Jesus.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I like
if you're
that.
in your fifth marriage, you should sit down with Ryan for some counseling, because there's probably something you need to work through. I'm just saying
the 100%
issue, not because you've been divorced, but like there's a character.
No, right. Like it's funny. Yeah.
Probably even the second marriage. For a lot of people, even your first marriage.
It's funny how many people, approach it thinking, oh, it'll be different this time, but nothing has changed in their philosophy
it's
of
the
marriage.
Same way that people think when they're engaged or dating, like when we get married, it's not going to be different. Like somehow you're going to be a different person the moment you say I do.
Right.
Yeah. Until your philosophy about marriage is in line with the gospel, you're going to continue having the same problems.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. You know who's been persistently a problem in my life?
A problem of awesomeness.
Steven. We are at the Garden Audio. Go give him a follow, send him a thumbs up, send him a message that says that you're happy that he takes care of us over here at Simpler. While you're over there on social media, follow us at Simpler Pod. That is the place to reach out to ask questions. This is a hard topic, just as we talked about. It's difficult on a lot of levels. It's complicated on a lot of levels, and so we'd love to hear you guys' thoughts. Hear testimonies of how the Lord, or how maybe the church has treated you, the Lord's freed you from that, or maybe you're anticipating freedom and acceptance. I don't know where you guys are. So just to hear from you guys. Also, if there's any questions or any topics that you want to hear or see us talk about, please reach out through social media at SimplerPod. Shoot us a message, let us know. Share wherever you can, leave a review wherever you can. It helps the algorithm, it helps boost us so that we can grow the Simpler community and grow these conversations to a point where to more people are involved, like to see more of that growth, to see more of that shift, to see more people be free from the shackles of the world, shackles of law, shackles of a complicated view of Christianity, and lean into a simpler, Christ-centric view of Christianity. And now I'll say it the way I normally say it: keep Christ as core. What could be simpler than that? We'll see y'all next week. Bye.